Welcome to Michigan's WW1 Centennial News Report for July 2019, the miracle in Midland. Learn about the great technological breakthrough that happened there and why nobody knew about it. This State Report, July 2019. On Saturday, August 10th from 10 a.m. until 5 p.m. at the Michigan Military Heritage Museum located at 153 North Union Street in Grass Lake will be holding a WW1 Centennial event over there. Please plan to attend. For information, please go to our website ww1cc.org/Michigan and look under Events. To learn more about Michigan's WW1 Centennial or find out about events going on around the state, go to ww1cc.org/Michigan for the latest information on Michigan's WW1 Centennial. One century ago, July 1919. On July 1st, 1919, the postage rate for a 1-ounce piece of mail dropped from 3 cents to 2 cents. The postage rate was raised on November 2nd, 1917, due to the war. July 6, 1919, R-34 became the first aircraft to make the east-west transatlantic flight, landing on July 6, 1919 at Manola, Long Island, New York, after 108 hours in the air. She also returned to England and became the first two-way crossing. July 6, 1919, Berlin, Germany. The Institute for Sexual Science opened this day by physician Magnus Hirschfeld, and it was established to study the sexual science. July 8, 1919, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson returns to New York City from the Paris Peace Conference held at the Palace of Versailles. July 10, 1919, Washington, D.C. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson personally delivers the Treaty of Versailles to the United States Senate. July 13, 1919, Gregg County, Texas. The town of Longview, Texas had a race riot develop. It wasn't ended until General R.H. McDill of the Texas National Guard proclaimed national law and brought in the Texas National Guard. July 13, 1919. Boston Red Sox pitcher Carl Mays walks off the mound blaming his teammates for lack of support field. He was one of the league's premier pitchers. He started the season 5-9. In July, he was traded to the New York Yankees and went 9-3. July 19, 1919, Luton, England, which is just north of London. Following Peace Day celebrations marking the end of the First World War, ex-servicemen rioted and burned down the Luton Town Hall. July 21, 1919, Anthony Fokker establishes airplane factories in Hamburg, Germany, and Amsterdam, the Netherlands. July 19, 1919, Washington, D.C. A race riot develops which lasts until July 24th. It finally ends as President Wilson calls in the National Guard, about 2,000 troops, which finally end the violence. July 27, 1919, Chicago, Illinois. A race riot develops which lasts until August 3rd. That's when the National Guard troops finally come in and manage to get control of Chicago. Over 38 people died and 500 were wounded. July 31, 1919, Weimar, Germany. The Weimar Constitution, establishing the German Republic, is finally adopted. Until the United States entered the World War, they had no interest in chemical warfare, no knowledge of it, no skills in manufacturing chemical weapons or in using them in battle. All of this innocence and ignorance was stripped painfully away in the first few months following the entry into the war, April 1917. Dow Chemical and the town of Midland would play a key role in this drama. Herbert Dow's daughter, Margaret Tousley, once said about her father, "The worst thing I ever had to do was to make chemical weapons." She also said, "Dad and Mom hated the fact that they had to make war gases. I remember they got old during that time. There was apparently no yes or no, you just made it." Early in October 1917, Albert W. Smith, Dow's schoolmate and lifelong friend, received a message from George A. Burrell, Assistant Director, U.S. Bureau of Mines, summoning him urgently to Washington. Burrell had just been recalled to government service and was put in charge of research relating to gas warfare. The title masked his real assignment. He was shortly to become Colonel Burrell and play a leading role in the formation of the U.S. Army's Chemical Warfare Service. As the Germans were relying more and more heavily on gas warfare, Burrell told Smith that the Army was moving rapidly to meet the problems posed by this, and he asked if Smith could devote two-thirds of his research time to the problems the Army would ask him to look into. Burrell gave Smith two immediate tasks. One was to find a way to develop anti-dimming device for gas mask eye lenses, and the other was to find a better gas absorbent for the mask. Colonel Burrell would go on to recruit some of the nation's most notable chemists from campuses and industry for his research group. Eventually, there was more than 3,000 specialists. The buildings and the grounds of the American University in Washington, D.C. were taken over as headquarters for the group and set up as research laboratories. Albert Smith and Herbert Dow were thrust into the U.S. chemical warfare program in the midst of its birthing. At that point, its activities were shadowy. What it was doing was concealed until the war was over. Confusing. The U.S. military had no chemical warfare expertise, so most of the initial leadership was civilian, working on civilian organizations under military rules. Changing daily, a full-fledged U.S. chemical warfare service was officially unveiled only 4 months before the Armistice Day, and expanding wildly. It grew from nothing into a full branch of the Army within a year. Such was the organization that the two were now asked to help as their part of winning the war. At Herbert Dow's invitation, Albert Smith brought more of his military research to the Dow Chemical plant in Midland, Michigan. Coupled with the products they made was a smokescreen for naval vessels and also various types of toxic gases. Two of the toxic gases they made were tear gas, which was called Y2, and also Y11, which was used in training of soldiers for gas attacks. In the spring of 1915, the Germans initiated gas warfare by releasing chlorine gas at the front. It proved not to be very effective. This started the science of gas warfare, and with the aid of Germany's top chemists, they introduced new gases. On July 12, 1917, the Germans introduced a devastating new agent called blister gas, or mustard oil, or is now generally known as mustard gas. It had a faintly mustardy smell and was used in the front. It caused blindness, raised great blisters, and was often fatal. A famous painting by John Singer Sargent shows a line of troops blinded by it, each soldier clinging to the man ahead of him as they are led to the first aid station. The first day that mustard gas was used, it blasted a hole 5 miles wide in the British and Canadian lines near Ypres. February 13, 1918, Colonel Burrell of the Gas Warfare Service called Albert Smith and Herbert Dow to Washington and asked them to work on a new problem, to develop a process and the manufacture of mustard gas. The Allies decided they could not afford to have Germany hold the monopoly on mustard gas. They were launching a crash program also. They had some of the best chemists in the West working on the problem. Albert Smith was involved because of his outstanding success with tear gas agents, and they were hoping he could do the same with mustard gas. Albert Smith's diary begins with an account of his meeting with Colonel Burrell and a notation. decided to make a small experiment on this at Midland, and if successful, build an experimental plant. Within 2 weeks, Mr. Smith had cleaned up his other loose ends on wartime projects and was in Midland, Michigan, working on G-34, the military code name for mustard gas. During the next few weeks, Albert Smith worked non-stop on different methods of producing mustard gas. Soon, Smith wired the War Department and told him that he had successfully made G-34. The U.S. Army dispatched troops to take over and operate the modest Midland pilot plant, which now became part of the Edgewood Arsenal. Suddenly, the plant became a secret military operation, operated exclusively by soldiers under a military guard, in one corner of the Dow Chemical plant. On May 21, 1918, soldier Joseph E. Ritzer, Sr. wrote in his diary, "I finally arrived at Midland around 4 p.m. My first impression was anything but favorable. The lieutenants met us at the depot with a list of names of people who were willing to room us. I was very fortunate to secure a room with a trained nurse by the name of Miss Murphy. She certainly has made my stay very pleasant, and it certainly seems like a nice house." When the soldiers graduated from the training course on May 30th, they had a photo taken in front of the education building. In the center is Nurse Winifred Murphy. She was a popular young lady, and the soldiers insisted that she be included in the photo. In the weeks before the troops arrived, Nurse Murphy had treated minor burns that occurred during the gas's manufacture, and began to feel that they had some familiarity with the treatment of mustard gas burns. Old-timers at the chemical plant used to refer to the most dangerous chemicals as they worked with bad actors, and those who knew it said it about mustard gas that it was the worst they have ever encountered. A drop of it on the skin was enough to kill a person, it was said. After a few days, the soldiers became comfortable with the operation of the big 18-foot tumbler. Then an accident occurred. Its heavy lead lining jammed up, and 7 soldiers were sent inside the tumbler to repair it. Albert Smith had set up a rigid step-by-step procedure to be followed in such an event, and this procedure was followed to the letter, except that the lieutenant in charge did not insist on the men wearing rubber suits. About 3 hours later, after they finished the repairs, all 7 soldiers began to feel ill and show signs of mustard burns. They were sent to Nurse Murphy at the first aid room. A room next to the first aid room was quickly set up as a hospital ward, and the soldiers were moved in. They were immediately diagnosed as needing 24-hour care. Herbert Dow made sure they had the best care available and hired extra nurses. In the circumstances, their injuries were sustained in a secret military installation. The 2 rooms were declared a military hospital, and the Army sent in a medical officer to take charge. The medical officer who arrived was Captain Lester L. Roos. Captain Roos proceeded at once to make himself the most unpopular person possible. The day he arrived, he proposed to Nurse Murphy that they go over to Bay City that evening and get better acquainted. Bay City was wet, Midland County was dry. She declined. Captain Roos then asked her if she couldn't find a girl who'd go over to Bay City with him. Murphy said she wasn't that kind of girl. Captain Roos moved into the first aid room, which he took over as his quarters, and had the nurses prepare meals, sometimes at midnight. Even worse, Murphy and the other nurses were convinced that the captain did not know what he was doing medically. The nurses were convinced that the treatment that Captain Roos was prescribing was actually killing the patients. Captain Roos decided that he was going to have the patients moved from Midland to Bay City. Some of the parents of the soldiers injured started writing letters to Washington. Captain Roos decided to keep the men at Midland. Then an astonishing thing occurred. Captain Roos's left foot began to swell and show signs of mustard gas burns. Someone had put a drop or 2 of mustard gas on his shoe while it was by the side of his bed in the first aid room. In the brouhaha that resulted, it did not take long to find out who had done this. It was Winifred Murphy. The military authorities demanded that Herbert Dow fire Winifred Murphy, as well as her accomplice, Ivan Harlow. Murphy was fired, because no one could defend what she had done. But Dow defended Ivan Harlow, feeling him innocent of any wrongdoing. In fact, Harlow lived to be 100 years old and remained on the Dow payroll for another 40 years or so. One of the more amazing aspects of this episode was that the whole thing was hushed up. Nothing appeared in the local press, no story circulated around town. Joe Ritzer, one of the soldiers, though he lived with the Murphy family, knew nothing about the event. Ivan Harlow seems not to even have told his family about it. Outside of a handful of insiders, no one knew what happened. It was all a military secret and remained that way for 70 years or so until a series of sworn statements were turned up in the Dow archives. Herbert Dow had asked Joe Bayless, a notary public who did legal odds and ends for the company, to take statements from the soldiers, nurses, and others involved in case the matter ever came up in court. A few days after the incident, Herbert Dow received a telegram from Major General William Siebert, commanding general of the Chemical Warfare Service, ordering an immediate and complete halt to all mustard gas activities in Midland. This included the new full-scale mustard plant that Albert Smith had designed, then under construction. In fact, it was only 2 to 3 weeks from going into full production. In the interim, production had continued at the pilot plant. This was an amazing order to be issued in the middle of a war in which mustard gas was required by the military and only being successfully produced in Midland. Smith had visited the Edgewood Arsenal, where it was being made, and recorded in his diary, "Conditions there in a G-34 very bad." Chart in Colonel McPherson's room showed production in the first 20 days in August, less than 3 tons per day. The teeny Midland pilot plant was equipped to make 7.5 tons daily, but the new plant, commissioned by Colonel Walker, had been scheduled to produce 20 tons daily, half of the Army's estimated total needs. Albert Smith and Herbert Dow hurried off to Washington to appeal to General Siebert. They were received with polite frigidity and were not even able to find out what the case against them was. They knew that Captain Ruse had filed a report complete with photos of his swollen left foot. That was the end of Dow Chemical's involvement in mustard gas. The Midland product did arrive in France, in what amount is not clear. In the end, the Midland mustard gas was never used in France, nor did the U.S. forces use any mustard gas as a weapon. After Christmas, Albert Smith went to Washington, D.C., and on December 30th handed his resignation in from service of the U.S. Bureau of Mines, effective January 1st, 1919. Nurse Winifred Murphy continued working as a nurse around Midland for a few years, and then married a doctor and moved to Sacramento, California, where she had 5 children, and lived a reasonably happy life. Her intended joke on Captain Ruse seems to have provided the excuse for making mustard gas exclusively at the Edgewood Arsenal under military supervision. And while he never said so, Herbert Dow was probably just as happy that it turned out that way. The miracle at Midland was a truly great scientific feat. Not only could they outproduce the United States Edgewood Arsenal, which had over 1,000 chemists working on this project, but also they could outproduce the French, British, and even the best chemists in the world in Germany. And even though its mustard gas was never used in war, the scientific breakthrough truly was a miracle in Midland.
What's the time? 9, all in line. All right, boys, now take it slow. Are you ready? Eddie, very good, Eddie. Over the top, let's go. Quiet, else it's not a riot. Keep your proper distance, follow along. Hover, mother, and when you see me hover, obey my orders and you won't go wrong. There's a Midland buffer coming, look out. Hear that roar, there's one more. Stand fast, but there's a very light. Don't gas or they'll find you all right. Don't start a bumming with those hand grenades. There's a machine gun, the holy spade. Alert, gas, put on your mask. Adjust it correctly and hurry up fast. Drop, there's a rocket for the black barrage. Down of the ground, close your hand, don't stand. Creep and crawl, follow me, that's all. What do you hear? Nothing here, don't fear, all clear. That's the life of a stroll when you take a patrol. Out in no man's land, ain't it grand? Out in no man's land. There's a million weapons coming, look out! Hear that roar? There's one more, and fast as a very light. Don't gasp or to find you all right. Don't start the bumming with those hand grenades. That machine gun, the holy stage. Alert, gas, put on your mask. Adjust it correctly and hurry up fast. Drop, there's a rocket for the March barrage. Down, hug the ground, close you can, don't stand. Creep and crawl upon.